Welcome to our webinar, Waste, Water, and Worth, the Hidden Drivers of Health. Where we live matters. Before we begin, we at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health respectfully acknowledge that our work takes place on the occupied and unceded lands of Native American tribes. We honor the enduring connection of Indigenous peoples to these land and waters. We also recognize the contribution of the enslaved people of African descent, Indigenous laborers, Chinese railroad workers, Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II, and countless immigrant and American-born workers whose labor has built, shaped, and continues to sustain this nation. Today's webinar is the fourth in our 2026 Climate and Health Equity webinar series as part of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. The CHEF program recognizes the need for more climate and health leadership with a sharper focus on equitable climate solutions. The goal of the fellowship is to educate physicians from populations that face greater burdens from climate effects and are underrepresented in medicine to become leaders in climate and health equity, education, advocacy, and policy solutions. I'm Dr. Venice Curry, the Associate Director of the Climate Health Equity Fellowship. Also joining me from the consortium to run this webinar are Dr. Shanita Johnson, Director of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship, Dr. Kimberly Williams, Director of Operations and Strategy at the Medical Society Consortium, and Clarissa Payton, CHEF Program Assistant, who will be available through the chat for any technical questions during the webinar. The webinar is hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health and is held for 1 hour on the second Friday of each month at 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel and for future viewing as part of our Climate and Health Equity webinar series. Water is fundamental to life, and access to clean water directly impacts the health and well-being of communities, those that we live in, those that we serve. We particularly recognize vulnerable communities that face significant environmental, public health, and infrastructure challenges. This webinar will highlight the intersection of water, health, environmental justice, and community leadership, with a very sharp focus on community-driven solutions, advocacy, and equitable approaches that can address and improve health outcomes. Today, we are honored to have a true luminary in this space. Our guest, Dr. Catherine Coleman Flowers, is the founding director of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. She is a tireless and fierce advocate for environmental justice for communities across the country. She is known to build partnerships among neighbors, to local elected officials, regional nonprofits, to federal lawmakers and global organizations in order to identify and implement solutions to the intersecting challenges of water and sanitation, as well as infrastructure, public health, and economic development. She is the author of 2 books, and as you can see, there are a lot of part of her bio to share. But rather than take up any additional time, we will place her bio in the chat for you to be able to view at your own time. The general format for today's webinar will be one 40-minute presentation where our speaker. We ask that you put comments or any links to any resources in the chats, and that we will get to as many questions to our presenter as we can during our Q&A. We ask that you please keep yourself muted so that we are not interrupted by any background noise. And I'm happy to say, Ms. Dr. Flowers, we are turning the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
You know, I spent a lot of time in Sunday school. And in Sunday school, I was told stories where people beat the odds. David and Goliath, how David was able to slay a giant with a slingshot. Those stories of inspiration have always inspired me to speak up, speak out, and take action. I don't think that there's anyone that doesn't want their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and the seventh generation not to have access to clean water.
Good afternoon. I bring you greetings from Huntsville, Alabama. I'd like to start off by saying I am a country girl from Lowndes County, Alabama. And no matter where I go in life, I always acknowledge that it was my country girl upbringing that prepared me for what I do today. I just remember, and I mention this because my grandmother, who was born in Lowndes County, would never say she was from Lowndes County. She always said she was from Selma, because I guess people didn't want to acknowledge that they were from the country. But I'm country and proud, and I state that everywhere I go. So coming from Lowndes County, Alabama, I had the opportunity to be in the company of a lot of people who were modern day Joan of Arcs in terms of the work that they did around civil rights and voting rights. Lowndes County is located between Selma and Montgomery. It has its own illustrious history. A lot of people don't know that the original Black Panther Party was founded in Lowndes County. And a lot of the work that was done around voting rights in the original Black Panther Party was actually the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which ran its own slate of candidates for office. And these are candidates who had been former sharecroppers who organized locally because they wanted the right to vote. In addition to that, if you know anything about W.B. Du Bois and his work, a lot of his work was informed by the time that he spent in Lowndes County. He actually spent time there and did research and a survey on sharecropping in Lowndes County, because one of the first sharecroppers unions was organized in the early part of the last century in Lowndes County, Alabama. And his labor study was so explosive because sharecropping actually replaced slavery in a lot of ways. But his labor study was so explosive that they refused to publish it. So in that vein, I walk and stand on the shoulders of all the people that came before me and did this work in Lowndes County and prepared me for, again, what I'm doing today, and I acknowledge them. As it relates to environmental justice, just to give you a little bit more about my background, I was a history teacher. Being a history teacher, I've always learned how to connect history to the work that is happening here, because I think that we cannot understand where we are today if we don't understand what came before us. So I was fortunate in that regard. And when I returned to Lowndes County in 2000, in early 2000, I went there for the purpose of switching from being a history teacher to teaching to working on economic development. And what I found that in places like Lowndes County that have no infrastructure to support positive business development, that's where people want to place the landfills. That's where they want to place the dirty businesses. That's why actually we have a plant that's located along Highway 80 in Lowndes County that was the counterpart to the plant that released the chemical in Bhopal, India, that killed a lot of people. We have the similar plant in Lowndes County right now. And I found that it was very, very hard, because when people talk about economic development, they equate it with jobs. And in places where they don't have jobs, they're happy to accept whatever is given to them. Hence, we have places around the U.S., especially in the South, and places like Cancer Alley, which I've had the opportunity to spend some time and see, where a lot of absentee landowners sold land to those multi-industrial complexes that have built these chemical plants in Cancer Alley that are harming not only the environment, but the health and well-being of the people that live there as well. I saw the same thing when I went with Reverend William Barber's New Poor People's Campaign and went through Appalachia and saw for the first time poor white people that looked like they could have been poor Black people from Lowndes County. Unfortunately, they didn't know it. And I think that that's part of the division when it comes to defining environmental injustice, is that some people assume that they are not victims when in fact they are victimized. When we went through Appalachia, one of the things I saw for the first time was mountaintop removal and how they were blowing the tops off of mountains. And people talked about how when they did start doing fracking in the community, they would light their water and it would burn. So those are the kinds of things that when people talk about environmental injustice, they think that it's only in communities, only in Black communities, but they're also in rural communities, they're in poor communities. And when I went down to the colonias along the Texas border, and there we went, and I went there, actually EPA had invited me to come at the time. And when we went there, I was told not to talk about sanitation, and everywhere I went, see, that's when we think the people are not smart, but the people had done their research. And everywhere they went, I didn't ask about it. They told us about the sanitation issues that they have there, the broken infrastructure, in some cases, no infrastructure. That experience helped me redefine how I even looked at rural communities or unincorporated communities, because in these places where they're rural, but there is densely populated with people living in mobile homes. And I was really surprised, and it reshaped my thinking on that. So as I look at environmental injustice, I think we need to expand the definition because of the harms that are being done around the country to people that have been marginalized. And in my view, marginalized people are those people that don't have money. You don't have money, you don't have power. And generally, folk come in and they do not consider the community or the welfare of the community when they cite these plants and other kinds of things that do environmental harms in their midst. I had the opportunity to serve as the co-vice chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And on there, I served with some noted people that you know, like Dr. Robert Bullitt, Dr. Beverly Wright, and many others from around the country. And one of the things that I advocated for is how we need to be strategic when we address environmental justice. We should not define or restrict policy around environmental justice to where when a new administration comes in, they can wipe it out. And when I talked about that, I think that people were standing on principle in what they had done before, but we have to keep in mind that things are changing and evolving, and we have to change and evolve as well so that we can make sure that we protect the people we're trying to protect. For an example, if we look at, I can just use the work that I've done around sanitation. When I went back to Lowndes County, one of the things that I found is that people were being arrested because they could not afford on-site sanitation. When we start raising that issue because of people not wanting to identify being for rural communities, or there were Black folks that didn't want to acknowledge that there were Black people that were living in those conditions, I found it hard to get alliances and help anywhere when it came to that. I actually had to go outside of the US at some point and deal with the UN, because part of the Sustainable Development Goals is the human right to water and sanitation. It was only then where I started gaining traction in other areas, when I went outside the United States and started shining light on the fact that we're in the richest nation in the world, and there are people here living with raw sewage on the ground. And this has always been, it didn't just start, because I grew up with a slop jar in an outhouse. But I thought when I moved back that those things had changed, and that had not changed. And what was very helpful to me is when I was able to finally read an op-ed in the New York Times that was written by Dr. Peter Hotez. And Dr. Hotez was at Baylor's National School of Tropical Medicine, and he wrote an op-ed about tropical diseases being on our shores. And one of the things that he mentioned that was an issue was wastewater. And I reached out to him, Googled him, found an email address, wrote him, told him about Lowndes County, and we met the next week. And he said, Catherine, every time I talk about tropical parasites being in this country, they want to blame it on immigration. And I basically said to him, I can take you to a place that some people haven't been to Atlanta, let alone going out of the country. And that way, that is how we ended up doing the parasite study. But what was important is although the doctors that were sent there wanted to work on this issue, if they would not have been successful in collecting fecal blood and water samples without local people on the ground being engaged in this research. And I didn't realize it at the time, but what I was learning was the importance of research to bring validity to what people are seeing on the ground. Because people were telling me that they were having different kinds of issues that doctors didn't seem to know how to treat. And even when I was exposed, I went to a home where a woman, she had one autistic child. I think she was 24 years old, in her early 20s at the time, pregnant. And the health department, the Alabama Department of Public Health, was threatening to put her in jail because she did not have on-site sanitation. And when I went there, I was smart enough, one, to call a member of the the Alabama congressional delegation and let them know that I was going, one. Two, I took a reporter with me because I wanted to hold them off from putting her in jail. And behind her single white mobile home was a pit of raw sewage. It was in October, I never forget it. It was teeming with mosquitoes. But I could also see the remains of everything that had been in her toilet before it came out into that pit, that hole behind her house. And because I was wearing a dress at the time, the mosquitoes bit me on my leg. And I could see where they had drawn blood. And I never thought about it before then, the possibility, because I had been going around raw sewage for years at that point, the possibility of me potentially getting sick. And it was after that that a rash developed on my body. And it was primarily on the trunk of my body. And then I had a few spots on my leg. I went to my doctor and I said to her, I want you to give me a blood test to see could I have potentially have gotten something from these mosquitoes that were nesting on raw sewage, and then they bit me and they drew blood. And she ran the test and the test came back negative, although I had this rash on my body. And I asked her then, is it possible that there are diseases in this country? Now it was far-fetched because this was pre-COVID. Is it possible that there are diseases in this country that people have that American doctors are not trained to treat because we think they're third world diseases and we have third world conditions in this country? And she said yes. So it was after that that I started doing more investigating. I started writing more, doing more research, and found out about hookworm and its existence in the United States before, and even came to the conclusion that it's just possible that hookworm was never really eliminated from the US. Because I went and did some research and found out the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, which was the forerunner to the Rockefeller Foundation, that they had the way they were investigating hookworm in the Black community. They hired a doctor that was a Tuskegee who sent out a survey to Black doctors to see how many people they had treated with hookworm. And being from the South and knowing that a lot of people that lived in rural communities didn't have access to doctors. Those doctors, I went to see where those doctors were located. They were in the urban areas, they were in cities. A lot of them weren't even in the South. So clearly they weren't going to see cases of hookworm unless they were treating someone who had just left the South. So I felt that this was something that was not eliminated because I grew up throughout my childhood seeing people living with raw sewage on the ground or seeing people living without a septic system that worked properly. So consequently, that research validated our work around water and sanitation. Partnering with doctors, people that had the scientific know-how, the community working together with people with this type of training help us to write the papers that were necessary to bring it to the attention eventually of the President of the United States, which explains why I ended up going to the White House and introducing President Biden. And he even launched an effort to address this problem. However, last year, the new administration decided that the resolution with the Alabama Department of Public Health, because when we did the study, they actually put on their website that our study was not valid because we used PCR technology. And that was really short-sighted because PCR technology, they said it was not approved by the FDA. So anything to invalidate the fact that we had found what we found. But that led to us filing, we ended up filing complaints with the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services, which led to the first time civil rights law was used to deal with environmental justice. And that led to a resolution with the Alabama Department of Public Health to try to resolve the problem in Lowndes County and other parts of the Black Belt. But last year, this administration released, had a press release in February of last year announcing that they were ending the resolution regarding sanitation in Lowndes County because it was illegal DEI. What DEI has to do with using that as I mentioned before, how they use abortion to divide people. Here they are using DEI as a code word to also divide people. But the reality is that the people that were suffering in Lowndes County weren't just Black people. The Black people were the only ones that were speaking out. There were white people whose septic systems were not working either. And that is the unfortunate part of how we deal with these issues, that some people hide and pretend like it doesn't impact them. But environmental harm doesn't really know race. If you live in that same community, you're going to have those same problems. So we have, with our work, we've been going into communities that generally didn't see themselves as environmental justice communities. One was East Palestine, Ohio. When we were invited to go there, we were kind of surprised at how well we were received, because when we went there, East Palestine, as you know, is where there was a train derailment, and it released all these chemicals that not only contaminated the soil, but also contaminated the air and the water. And a lot of those places, they have creeks. They call them creeks there, but the creeks run underneath people's houses. And a lot of those chemicals went into those creeks. And when we went there, people were telling us about all the health issues they were having. I mean, I remember going to the home of a family where the gentleman that I was talking to had on a Liberty University shirt and we were seated under a tree in his yard. His wife had cancer. He was trying to sell his house because they were trying to get out of there. They felt the area was contaminated, was no longer healthy, but nobody wanted to buy property there because of the train wreck and the contamination that still exists in the community. And that evening there was a dinner in town, and these were places where everywhere we saw signs for people that probably voted against their interests. But that night, close to 300 people showed up at this dinner. And even the pastor who we had met with called his brother and had his brother and his family come as well, because that night, people came up to us and said, "Thank you for caring about us. Thank you for coming." And I think that that is what we're going to have to do in order to address these inequities that are happening, because poor people are suffering everywhere, not just poor people in African American communities, but also poor people in white communities too. And I keep reminding them that they have to stop voting against their interests, because we are all in harm's way. Actually, the theme of my most recent speaking tour is entitled "We're All in Harm's Way." So as a result, one of the things that I think is very important, and even with them, to prove that they're seeing and experiencing what they're seeing and experiencing, they need the medical community to reach out and help them to be able to clarify what they're seeing, because everybody there is working for the company that created the problem. So therefore, they're not getting the good answers to the problems that they know that they have. The other thing that we have to do more of is have proximity to the problem. You know, one of the persons that I admire a lot is Brian Stevenson. And I used to work when I did the parasite study, I was working at the Equal Justice Initiative. And one of the things Brian talks about is proximity. We cannot find solutions to problems that we have not seen. We have to go there and visit and spend time. We also have to recognize that the local people are also experts, because Mama and them been sitting on that porch seeing that same problem for the last 50 years. And they can give us the kind of information and insight that we need to be able to document this, find solutions and offer to those people that are making policy, tell them where they're wrong and where they need to be right. And more recently, going back to Lowndes County, we have found that there's been an issue that I think a lot of you are probably seeing as well that has become an issue for us too, and that's the issue of data centers. They are proposing to build along the Selma to Montgomery Marsh Trail a hyperscale data center. To build in a place where people do not even have access to sanitation. To build in a place where septic systems were already failing, the water tables are very high. But even if you look at the high water tables and you look at data centers and how much water they use, and communities around the country are talking about how their wells are running dry, how their water pressure is falling. And there's an opportunity to do research on how they can impact the health of people living by. People are already talking about how they can't sleep, how there's noise, constant noise all the time. If you're going to put it in a rural community like that, noise is going to travel even faster and further than it would in an urban area. In addition to that, what is it going to mean to people that are already poor and struggling to have to pay higher power bills when power bills are already high? When I first started doing this work with Bob Wilson many years ago, it was not just with sanitation. We also had the highest power bills in the country in Lowndes County. So the research has shown us everywhere where they built these data centers, the power bills have gone up. And that's going to make it harder for the people who are not going to benefit from it. They want to locate there with a 30-year tax abatement. And I'm sure that our local county commissioners that I know, because everybody in Lowndes County is two first cousins once removed. But the bottom line is they think they're doing a good service because what they hear, there's a $1.5 billion investment. But this $1.5 billion investment comes with environmental harms, and it also comes with harms to health. Of the $1.5 billion investment, they claim they're going to create about 2,000 construction jobs. Those will not be local people from Lowndes County. At the end of the day, they may have 25 to 30 people working in the data centers. Those will not be people from Lowndes County. We know that data centers, looking at what's happening in Memphis, they create heat islands. They also create pollution. So and then we're concerned because it's close to the river. What does that mean? Because this is all new. And I think what we have to start doing is not only document where these data centers are located, but we need to start documenting as doctors talk to patients about where they live, see if are they proximate to areas that could create environmental harm. You know, when we were in Cancer Alley recently, there were people there talking about how much cancer is actually there. The people from the American Cancer Association were there. So doctors, when I was talking to doctors at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, and they wanted to know what they could do to try to identify so they can come up with better prognosis and ways to treat patients that are coming from areas that have environmental harms. And I told them all over Texas, we need to look and see if we can map where the environmental harms are coming from and what are the health consequences of it. We can get a better handle of people understanding the roles that these companies have to play in paying for the ills that they're causing in these communities. And we're seeing this everywhere. More recently, you may have seen on the news, we're in California, where they have oil rigs everywhere, all over the state. We had a young lady who's a fellow with Creed, who was responsible for, she's one of the youngest activists, saying they should have a set aside where they drill for oil, for how far they should be away from homes, because she grew up around them drilling for oil, and as a result had nosebleeds all the time and real bad asthma. At the age of 18, had to lose her female reproductive organs because of cancer. And there are far more people that are exposed and have lost out on their health and well-being than we know because it has not been documented. So if we can find a way, and some people may have already done it, we would like to have access to that if it's available, and put it out there so people can see it. Where people live in proximity to polluting plants that may create health issues. We have found out that PFAS, for an example, has an impact on the reproductive organs of women. And in a lot of areas, a lot of our water is contaminated with PFAS. And there has been, by this administration, a move to try to uh, get rid of a lot of regulation around it as opposed to protecting families and protecting people that live in these areas. So I see your roles and I see this fellowship as an absolute in what we need as it relates to getting sustainable solutions to make sure that our communities are healthy, that we protect their well-being, and we also protect the future. Because if people are not healthy, they're not going to be productive. And I think that everything that we do, because I subscribe to the seventh generation principle, is that everything that we do, we should do it in such a way that it has a positive impact for 7 generations to come. And that is part of what I've learned growing up in Lowndes County, being around the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, learning from people in my community, staying connected, but also making sure that we find ways in which we can change policies to keep people healthy and out of harm's way. As we deal with climate change, we're going to have more and more problems. I was in Chicago yesterday, and it was very hot. And I note that people in Chicago in the past, when they've had heat waves, people have died. And I was thinking when I was there, we were in a building that was air conditioned. What if there was no air conditioning? How are people going to survive? How are poor people going to survive? We have to make sure that the homes that are built to protect people. When I go to Lowndes County and other areas where poor communities are and people living in mobile homes, and it's getting very, very hot. In their homes, you can see the mold growing on the outside. And in some cases, I've been in homes where people had mold on the inside as well. You know, one of the persons I write about in my book, Waste, is Pamela Rush. And Pamela at that time had a 9-year-old daughter who was sleeping with a CPAP machine. Her house was full of mold and mildew. She did not have sanitation. She was straight piping effluent right from our toilet right on top of the ground. And there's so many other Pamela Rushes around this country and so many other children that are suffering as a result. We have to be on the front lines of finding solutions to these problems. So I applaud you for this fellowship that you have. I also applaud you for the fact that you're interested to do this work, because a lot of people are more interested in making money as opposed to actually doing what medicine was created to do in the first place, which is to save lives. So I applaud all of you for that. And one of the things that we're asking for, we're going to be making a major announcement soon about the work that we're going to be doing and research that we're going to be doing about data centers and health. And we're looking for partners to work with us on this, because people around the country are looking for solutions. And because this is so new, this may be an opportunity for us to help people create the type of policy that's necessary to build them better. Because I don't think we're going to be able to stop AI, and we're not going to be able to stop data centers, but we can make sure that they're not putting them in the middle of neighborhoods that are already overburdened. We can make sure that they're not using generators that are putting more pollution in the air. We can make sure that they're not using up all the water. There has to be better ways. And the way we can do this is using health as a way, because that was the way I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the fact that I had not partnered with a doctor who's a pediatrician and did that research. And that research, of course, was elevated, and it led to so many other things. But what's the most important part of it is to be able to shed light on a problem that we need to still solve. And we're still working on trying to address the sanitation issue. And I'm sure that there are people on this call, especially if you've lived or gone or still have folk that live in rural areas, have seen what I've described today. And we still need to find solutions. Not only do we need to find solutions as it relates to making sure people have a working sanitation, but we need to find sustainable solutions that will last for more than 2 or 3 years, because things are now built to break down as opposed to live to last for a time. And sanitation is one of those things that's going to be necessary for us to have a kind of health and well-being as a nation to progress, and so that the next generation won't have to worry about this. Someone asked the question, what can you do? We would love to partner. We would love to partner. We would love to even host taking people that are interested in seeing what I've described to these areas firsthand. Because I think being proximate, if I had to plan the dream trip would be you would come to Montgomery. We would go to the Lynching Memorial and Museum first so you can get an idea of what we're dealing with. It tells the history of the area. Then once you go to the area and see how people living, you have a better understanding of why it is the way it is. And then we can work together on potential solutions. Maybe even looking at, in some communities, going there doing health clinics. A lot of people were telling us that I agree. Someone just said, let's do some fundraising. We can do that. There were a lot of people that were telling us when we went to these communities that they had to choose between buying grocery or getting medication. And these people that were talking had high blood pressure. They had diabetes. In Lowndes County, we found that there were so many people in Lowndes County that had diabetes. They had a bus taking them to dialysis. And I can't tell you how many people, family members I have lost to dialysis. I'm not to dialysis, to diabetes, because they lost a limb and then eventually their kidneys just stopped working. So we really have to do the type of work to make sure that this doesn't become a reality. I used to think when I grew up, they used to call diabetes sugar diabetes. I know some of you've heard that. And I thought, as a child, I thought you got it from eating sweets. But as time went on, I learned more that there was more to it. Both of my parents were diabetic. But because I live a different type of lifestyle and I eat different kinds of foods that they didn't have access to, I'm at 67, I don't have diabetes. So I know that it's not something that we have to have, but in a lot of our communities, because it's so common, we feel like it's something that's supposed to happen. And it's not something that's supposed to happen. So I think partnering and working through education, developing materials to educate young people and educate people that are on the ground in the communities about best practices, also educating people about what environmental injustice really is, and documenting this and working together and helping policymakers, because some of our policymakers, thinking they're doing the right thing, are agreeing to let these polluting entities come into our communities. But I think a lot of it is because they really don't understand. Now, of course, there are few that don't care. They care about the money. But a lot of people, it's because of the lack of really understanding why these are bad and what it can ultimately create for them and their families as well. And I think that that's where our partnership can be the strongest, on working together. Our organization is the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. Our website is www.creej.org. Please go there. We also have a newsletter that we've launched. We're asking people to sign up for it, and we would like to interview some of you about your work and your research, and be able to put it out there so that people in our community can see what you're doing as well, and it may be an opportunity to network. So I am going to pause here so we can have questions, because I love to have back and forth. Thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to the additional questions.
Thank you so much. That was a civil rights lesson, call to action, and everything in between. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now have an opportunity to ask some of those questions. We have some that are in the chat. Let's see. Okay. I think the first question starts with what can we do? And I think you said it pretty thoroughly, but if there's anything else that you want to add to that part of the question, what can we do?
But I think that we should connect the network. For an example, I can't see everybody that's on the call, but I am accessible if there's any way that we can network or connect you to resources that we know. We mentioned fundraising. There are people that I do know that are donors because I have to engage with them. Um, I can be reached either through Creed or I'm also on social media. I'm on X, I'm on Instagram, and usually when people reach out to me, I respond. And we also have a catch-all box if you reach out that way. So I think to let us know about your work so that we can promote it. But at the same time, we're looking to sign MOUs to be able to work with different organizations and share resources, because by doing that, we can expand our capacity to do this work.
And we are putting some of those links into the chat right now. One of the questions is, how can communities use legal tools, data, and public testimony to hold utilities and industries to account?
Oh, that's a great question. What a lot of communities, what we're seeing, I've seen various examples of that. In our case, uh, we used the legal tools. We was through Earth Justice, but we filed the legal cases with Health and Human Services. And the reason we chose Health and Human Services is because they fund Alabama Department of Public Health. You know, although the South is so anti-government, if it wasn't for government money, a lot of these entities in the South wouldn't exist because they're so poor. And we knew that that was one way in which we could get their attention. And that complaint was filed. Unfortunately, the DOJ took up the investigation and it led to some policy changes at that particular time. We've also partnered with, like, even with in this particular case, we partnered with organizations like the Southern Environmental Law Center. There's also the Natural Resources Defense Council. I would really love at some point to connect, if you're not already connected, to connect you all with NRDC. I'm on their board. They are best some of the best experts on environmental policy and law in the country. And a lot of the environmental law that is on the books is there because of legal actions taken by NRDC. So those are just some of the tools that can be done. And then in terms of research, I think the research has to be community-based research. I think what we have to do when we go into communities is ask them what kind of help do they need, because it's not going to be the same for every community. If you're in Eastern North Carolina, they're going to be talking about CAFOs and the impact of these CAFOs have on their water and their health. If you're coming to Lowndes County, you're going to be talking about septic tanks. If you're going to Cancer Alley, you're going to be talking about petrochemical plants. It's going to be all of these different kinds of things in different communities. Find out what they need and then work with them. In the Central Valley, when I went there and went to Allensworth, they were talking about the fact that, you know, the area, the lack of water, and they couldn't drink the water that they had because of the water table sinking. So there are different things that would be needed in different communities. So it should be community led. They should be equal partners in designing the research and also participation. And if it is published, the people that have helped with the research, their names should be included as well. And included as authors.
Yes. Yes. On those same lines of getting community to really participate, what are some of the best practices that you can share about building that community trust between community members and technical experts or academic institutions?
Well, I think it's being present, going there, spending time in the communities. And when I was working at one time as a practitioner in residence at Duke, and they were looking at doing research in the community, and I think that folk didn't understand the importance of when you go into a rural community, especially, you have to know somebody. You don't just show up and say, I'm from Duke University, I have this survey. People are not going to respond. They'll be nice, but they're not going to tell you the truth. They'll be polite as they tell you no. So what I said to them is that you have to spend time in the community first and develop the relationship. And you have to develop the relationship and to the point and have mutual respect for them. And mutual respect means, first of all, they said, how do we develop relationships? Well, when you go into the community, make sure that you're invited. Number two, make sure also that you do things and you get aligned with some of the organizations that are already in the community. Whenever I go somewhere, I go to church. Because I know if I'm going to a Black community, everybody's in church. And I always mention the fact that I'm from the country, and then everybody started nodding their head because a lot of them are from the country too. And then I may mention the fact that, my organization, I'm a Delta. Sometimes, the fact that I'm a Delta opens doors for me that wouldn't open for me otherwise. I just went to the University of North Alabama in Florence, and when they put they put it in the paper that I was speaking, I was invited by the Association of University, the American Association of University Women, to speak at the public library there. So when they put it in the paper announcing I was coming, they put in there that I was a Delta. A lot of Deltas showed up. I didn't even know they had that many Deltas in Florence, Alabama. So a lot of times we have the relationships, whether it's through the Masonic organizations, the NAACP, whomever. We have the relationships. We have to use those relationships because those organizations have representatives in all communities. I'm speaking to a group of ministers. I'm quick to mention that my brother is a missionary Baptist preacher. My brother is also a mental health practitioner. He's also an Omega. Those are three different groups that I can connect with just based on the fact that I have a frame of reference that they can relate to, and it brings down walls. So I think going into these communities with the intention of being there long term, and going into the community with the intention of building lasting relationships, and also respecting the indigenous knowledge, I think is going to be very important for institutions to make progress in terms of what they need to do to bring about the change that's necessary.
That's a perfect segue to the next question, which is about how to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous water practices with modern water management.
It's really interesting. I'm going to use one example because I know there are numerous. When I grew up and we went, first of all, people had tin roofs on their houses. And at the corner where the rain ran off, they had a barrel. And they collected that rain. And they used that water. And now people are doing it. I was just telling a friend of mine, I said, all the stuff people are calling New Age and stuff, that's what people did. My mother would cut the top off of a potato and plant it. That was her flowers in the house. She also grew peppers and stuff like that she would have in the house, and little small tomato plants and so forth. A lot of things that we associate with poverty because our people had to do it out of necessity. And my mother was a child who was born. She was a Depression era baby. So people that were Depression era babies did things just a little bit different. I think we need to go back to a lot of those folk ways that we developed and survived in rural communities, and a lot of which we transported to urban areas when we went there during the Great Migration, and use those to survive now because it helped us develop more sustainable living. And a lot of the things like my brother told me about my great uncle who took him to an area of land and did something with a stick on the land and told him, you don't have to dig for worms, you just do this, and they came to the surface. So I think part of the way we can incorporate local indigenous knowledge is talk to senior citizens. We don't do enough of that. I think that there should be more intergenerational interaction where we can start recording this information before it's lost.
Is an excellent idea. I think we have time for at least one more question. And so what cross-sector partnerships linking water, housing, food, and health create the most durable community resilience from your perspective?
That's a very good question. I think the problem is, I'm going to answer it a different way. I think the problem is the reason why we don't have those cross intersexual relationships is because people are protecting their own silos. But you can't talk about one thing without talking about the other. And I had the hardest time for the first 10 years of me doing this work to get people on the environmental justice side to understand that wastewater was a problem. Although they knew it was a problem, but for whatever reason, they didn't want to deal with it. So I think that we have to learn how to not silo our work and work and see the intersections between all of our work. Because if we use the Sustainable Development Goals as a guide, I think we can break down a lot of those barriers. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, the whole purpose is to end poverty. And if we institute those and try to use it as a guiding principle in terms of the human right to water and sanitation or human right to housing, et cetera, I think that we'll be able to find ways in which to work together. I haven't seen an organization that does all of them well yet, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I just haven't seen it yet. But what I did see, I had the opportunity to go to Italy in October of last year. I was invited by the what I call the Creole Pope. And this was the 10th anniversary of uh, Laudato Si. And there were people there from around the world talking about issues, and I was invited to come because of the issue of sanitation, which is prevalent around. It's not just a U.S. issue, but it was sanitation, it was housing, it was having access to healthy foods. It was all those things that we've talked about today, but it's happening globally. And for climate change, we've been talking to people that are living in islands that are disappearing because of climate change. Or how do you build sustainable housing in areas where the weather is changing? Or do you have to lift them up on stilts? Or do you have to move out altogether? All of these issues, we cannot talk about them separately as we talk about climate and health because they have an intersectional nature, and without talking about them together, we could actually exacerbate one issue by trying to, segregate them instead of talking about the intersectionality of all of them and working together on finding solutions.
I think we have one more question, and that is from Dr. White. How can we as physicians best educate our colleagues about what you are seeing on the front lines?
I think one way to do it, a great way to do it is to work with organizations like ours to help plan these excursions where you get to go and see it firsthand. Because we have the relationships, you probably be able to go into the communities that if you don't already have the relationships there, you wouldn't be able to go. But the model is John Lewis's Faith in Action. When John Lewis was alive, he had busloads of business people and politicians coming to Selma, but they would start I know at least the part that I saw was when they would go to Montgomery, then they would stop in Lowndes County, and then they would end up in Selma. But likewise, we need to do it. My trip through the Appalachia educated me and changed my point of view about white poverty because it's no different. The only difference is one group has been trained to think that they're better than the other folk when they're all being treated the same, or we're all being treated the same. So I think that is one way in which just partnering and working on taking these trips to see for yourself these areas. We're going with trusted messengers. I think that's how it doesn't end up becoming poverty porn, because people understand that the people that are working with them are working for their best interests and listening to them and letting them lead, as opposed to using them for exploitation. So yeah, we would love to also connect you with other organizations too that you can connect with to help educate your colleagues about what's happening on the front lines.
Thank you. I think we'll let that be the last word. We know that we could talk much, much longer with you. Pleasure to have you as our speaker, and we just want to thank you for the work that you've done, the work that you continue to do, and the way that you lead the work with such passion, such commitment and integrity.
Thank you.
As a reminder to our listeners, we are holding these webinars the second Friday of the month. Our next webinar will be July 10th, and we will cover a little bit more of housing, energy efficiency, and the political determinants. Before you leave, we do ask you to take the time to complete our webinar survey. The link has been placed in the chat, and we hope that you will take just a moment to complete that before you go. Again, we want to thank our speaker, and we want to thank you for joining us. This will conclude our session. Thank you again for your presence and for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.